thank you, Kelly. I almost can't follow that and feel like I should just say goodnight, but I won't. That was very nice. Thank you. There's so many people to thank. The folks that introduced me, University of Ottawa, Fulbright, ISSP, and of course, perhaps most importantly, you all for just coming here. It really means a lot. There's lots of things that you could do, and time is very, very valuable, and it means a lot to see you all here to listen to this important subject. So, hate, anxiety, hyper partisan tribal politics. The world does seem to be in a mess, not just in my country, the United States, but elsewhere. And there's plenty of data, as a social scientist I could point to, that kind of illustrates that. Plenty of surveys that talk about the level of anxiety and the concern people have of there being hyper-partisan politics, or you could look at U.S. justice statistics, which average in the United States, the average hate crime levels are in excess of 250,000 hate crimes a year. I am an academic, but I'm also a father, a husband, and a citizen, and I cannot help but have my scholarship be informed and be directed by this deep concern I have with what I'm seeing happening all around in my country, in Brazil, in Europe, in the UK, and elsewhere. And so what I would like to spend some time talking about today is some findings that I've kind of stumbled upon over the course of maybe the last 8 years as I've been researching food. And it came about almost accidentally when I started to see repeated themes kind of come out of my research, and those repeated themes eventually turned from a noise into a signal. And it eventually resulted in this new book project I have where I'm trying to take this signal and amplify it and tell a story about how food might actually help us rethink how we think about democratic politics and rethink how we think about increasing civility and reducing hate and alleviating anxieties in this world. But before I get to that, I want to provide some context to kind of situate what we all know is kind of already happening. So there's been a recent report that came out in the United States that talks about something that we've already kind of have known in our gut. And that is the so-called swing state, or the swing congressional district, is all but disappearing. There's no more red states and blue states, not even red counties or blue counties, but red and blue neighborhoods. And some evidence of this can be seen by the evaporation of what are referred to as swing districts. So in 1997, there were 164 swing districts that were scored as competitive. In the last presidential election, that was reduced to 72, down from 90 swing districts just 4 years earlier. Now, a lot of this talk around issues like this has pointed to what we refer to in the United States as gerrymandering. This is the idea that politicians are literally able to rewrite congressional districts and who's in a congressional district and who's out of a congressional district, which can help reinforce and solidify their ability to remain in office. But social scientists have been drilling into this data, and they think that's a little bit more complex than that. And they talk about a phenomenon that's referred to as geographic sorting. Now, geographic sorting is premised on something that social scientists have known for a long time. And this is just simply the phenomena of birds that flock together, or what we refer to as homophily, which is love of the same. This idea that we feel comfortable with people who are similar to ourselves. Now, some have taken this to the extreme and pointed out that some partisans actually choose to live in congressional districts where other like-minded partisans are located. But what tends to happen more often is that partisans end up self-sorting because of their taste in residential characteristics and other things like that. And so, for instance, Democrats, on average, tend to prefer things like walkable neighborhoods, community diversity, and places that celebrate difference. whereas Republicans, in contrast, and again, I'm speaking in terms of statistical averages, tend to prefer places where there's less residential density, which have opportunities for worship, and have institutions like schools that celebrate conservative values. And this tends to result in electorates becoming homogenized. Another phenomenon is some economic realities too. And I'm just drawing from instances in the US. I'll be also drawing from some Canadian instances because the US is, of course, the context I know best. But when you look at the last presidential election, Trump defeated Clinton in every income category among white voters. Trump supporters were also most dissatisfied with their economic place in the world, as illustrated by the figure on the left. And they were also the least likely to acknowledge the existence of racism, as evidenced by the figure on the right. And one could kind of glean from this also the assumption that economic dissatisfaction has something to do probably with this idea that someone of color is getting an unfair hand up in the world, which further kind of feeds into that dissatisfaction related to race. Another important thing deals with urbanization and ruralization. So in the 2016 presidential election, how it broke was strongly related to the population density of a county. So looking at federal election data in the US, almost 2/3 of US rural and small towns voted for Trump. Now, of course, we are seeing similar trends elsewhere in Germany, Australia. If you look at Brexit and how that vote went, overwhelmingly, in many places, the overwhelming vote was for Brexit in the countryside, whereas urban areas tended to vote more decisively to remain. And of course, the whole issue of trust seems to be collapsing in lots of places throughout the world. And perhaps where this is most evident, of course, is trust in the press and the media. And just a quick statistic here, you can see how, according to a recent survey, that trust really does seem to break fairly clearly along partisan lines. And then when you layer on top of all that the issue of recession recovery, some places are recovering from the recession at a greater rate than others. Some places have yet to recover from the recession. Metropolitan areas in the United States make up 36% of all counties, and yet they experienced, since the recession, 99% of all job growth. As for population growth, urban areas have experienced almost 80% of all population growth in the last 10 years, and more than half of rural areas in the United States have actually shrunk. So out of Ontario's roughly 13.4 million residents, you have slightly over 10% that live in rural areas. Rural residents in Ontario are on average older than their urban counterparts. And they're in urban areas are particularly advantaged because they have a larger proportion of people between the ages of 20 and 50. Of course, that's the prime working group. And something we don't think about is the services that are required from rural populations as a result of them having slightly older populations. It's a different service need, and because it's healthcare based, it's often more expensive as well. A 2019 Canadian report revealed that in general, rural areas are more likely to want a decrease in taxes and an increase in healthcare spending. They're more likely to advocate for less international trade. They're also less likely to believe that Canada should accept more refugees, be less willing to continue reconciliation with Indigenous groups, but are more willing to improve relations with the US than their urban counterparts. And addressing climate change is not a major priority for this group either. So some research that I've done that I think further contextualizes this in what I think are kind of interesting ways. So a few years back, I conducted a study that involved rural farmers in North Dakota and members of a very different agricultural community, our urban farm cooperative. Now, in order to elicit participation, because we were talking about some politically sensitive subjects, I agreed to not identify what the urban city was. But the point being that this was a sample involving some rural residents and some urban residents. And one of the things that I did is I asked all respondents to answer 2 questions. I asked them to answer actually a lot of questions, but I want to mention 2 in particular. I asked them to, quote, select 3 terms that describe what social justice means to you, unquote, and, quote, select 3 terms that describe what autonomy means to you, unquote. And then I showed them a list of 50 words that are associated with autonomy and 50 words that are associated with social justice. And then after they gave me those words, I fed them into word cloud mapping software. Now, before I show you the word clouds, because I think the word clouds are really illustrative, I just also want to mention I'm not claiming that these word clouds are representative for rural residents and urban residents. I realize if I would have went just a little bit further north, I would have been in Canada, and I would have talked with members of the National Farmers Union, who are the founding members of La Via Campesina. And if I would have talked to them, I very likely would have received some very different, or at least slightly different answers to those questions. So with that caveat, these are the 2 social justice word clouds. Urban Farm Cooperative on the left, and the North Dakota farmers and ag professionals, extension members, et cetera, on the right. Now note how the North Dakota farmers chose words that were associated with punishment, policing, and due process. Those chosen by the Urban Land Cooperative, in contrast, overwhelmingly emphasized words that had to do with their most selected term, equity. There's also a distinction between whether social justice was something that individuals achieved or whether it denoted something that society as a whole, perhaps, collectively achieved. I think we can further unpack this a bit by looking at the next set of word clouds dealing with the word autonomy. So note the repeated emphasis in the rural group placed on terms like individualism, self-determination, self-rule, and authority. So in philosophical parlance, you could probably say these terms have to deal with kind of the ideology of individualism, the philosophy of individualism and individual liberties. You know, a position that emphasizes self-reliance. And on the left, you know, that word cloud stands kind of a world away in some respects, or worldview away in some respects from the farmer group, with their emphasis on interdependence and solidarity, community. Now, I realize it might appear counterintuitive to think of a term like autonomy was something with interdependence until you hear the voices of some of the people that I spoke to. And I'll just give you one quote that I think kind of nicely captures that. So a single mother spoke directly to how independence arises for members in this group because of interdependence rather than in spite of it. Quote, "We can accomplish a heck of a lot more together. I feel like I have more control over my life, more independence when we can rely on each other." She added, "I certainly appreciate how sharing childcare opportunities as a community gives me the freedom to garden, but we can't forget that farming has always been a collective effort of sharing seed, of knowledge, and of work." Briefly, some data from another study that I've recently conducted. I like to refer to this as my 6-year-long state-level ethnography of rural and urban Coloradoans, where I interviewed some 350 people in the state of Colorado in rural counties, in urban counties, and also a category we have in the United States of frontier counties. And a frontier county is a county that has a population density of 6 people or less. And in Colorado, there are 23 frontier counties and 24 rural counties. So there are quite a few frontier counties in that state. Now, the data that I want to show you deals with another question that I asked individuals. And that question was, quote, "What most contributes to one reaching their fullest potential, society, community, or the individual?" And then to answer that question, I handed individuals a sheet of paper that had a triangle and had society, community, and individual on each of the four corners. And I asked them to place a dot in that triangle where in terms of how they would answer that question of what contributes most to one reaching their fullest potential. And then I converted that dot into a two-dimensional space, and I created a heat map from that. If you don't know what a heat map is, you'll soon see one. It's easier to see one than me explain it. And then I also asked them one other question. I said to identify the dot again, but this time answer as you think someone from the alternative metropolitan classification would. So if they were an urban resident, I asked them to try to put themselves in the shoes of a rural resident and answer that question. So these are the first heat maps where they answered it as themselves. So there's a couple interesting things that come out of this. There's some really interesting divergences between these groups in terms of where they see one reaching their fullest potential. But there's also some really interesting similarities between the groups as well. Now, two quick points. The first one, there certainly seems to be some of that individualism lying in the rural and frontier communities, although that individualism seems to be tempered by issues relating to family and community. And the other one takes a tiny bit more explaining to do, and to do that I'll just draw very briefly from the famous philosopher John Dewey and his 1927 book, The Publics and Its Problems. And in that book, he noted that the boundary between a public issue and a private issue shifts over time. And he argued in general that if a public issue only impacts the people that are engaged in that issue, it remains a private concern. But the moment you can make linkages from those private acts to it impacting somebody beyond the group that's doing the action, then it becomes a public concern. And of course, this is a long tension, and science plays into this as well when we start finding connections between things we do as individuals and as a community and things that have larger societal implications. I think it also speaks to some degree about some of what might appear at its face like a resistance to science. It might not be science per se that's being resisted, but the links that are being allowed to be made as a result of scientific findings. Now, and I want us to think about Dewey's argument in the context of these heat maps, specifically in the context of then when we see how they perceive how others might answer that question. So remember again, they were asked to now put themselves in the shoes of someone from an alternative metropolitan classification and answer the question. And you can think about this in the context of, say, a particularly contentious political issue like climate change. If they thought the so-called other political tribe thinks the way they think, then it perhaps is no wonder why they're so reluctant to engage in conversations, because for them, compromise is just not possible. If you're a rural resident and you think that's how urban people think, compromise probably in your mind's just a waste of time. And so I think this can also feed into some of the divisiveness as well in terms of how we perceive understandings related to public and private concerns and the value and worth of individual action and societal action. All right, so now this brings me to kind of why you're all here, the very boisterous title about how food can save the world, which is admittedly a bit hyped up, I'll tell you that now. But this does draw upon a book that I'm working on with Stanford Press tentatively titled Journeys to the Heartland, What Food Can Teach Us About Democracy, Inclusivity, and Empathy. And in the book, I kind of push for a different understanding of how to create a change of heart and a change of minds. And part of this comes out of a result also of me as an educator, being fed up with what I'm referring to as this head model of social change. This idea, which actually is rooted in political theory and goes back centuries, that if we can just present people with information, we can change their minds and change their behaviors, change what their bodies do and change the world. But if I'm going to be honest with you, I stand in front of students, hundreds of them a semester, and if I'm really honest with myself, I have asked myself, am I changing anybody's mind? And am I changing anybody's behavior? And I'm honestly not too sure if I am. So it has made me long question this traditional model of attitudinal change and behavioral change, and made me wonder if there's not a different way we should think about social intelligence and think about the relationship between values and attitudes and behaviors. And so similar to that, what data could I possibly show a bigot or a xenophobe? Or what data could I possibly show someone who believes that all Trump supporters are a basket full of deplorables, as of course Hillary Clinton famously described them? There is no data, there are no data that I believe I could show someone who's that firmly entrenched in one political tribe or the other. And then of course, liberal political theory also argues that if we can just get people around the table, we can get them to change their attitudes. And there are instances where you have professionally facilitated events where people come together and actually seem to talk things out. But that begs the question, what makes people want to attend those events in the first place? All those people self-select to be there. I want to engage those people who would never imagine sitting around the table with someone who prays to a different God, or someone who speaks a different language, or someone who's from a different country. Those are the people I think we need to think more about, not the people that are already willing to change their attitudes. Those people are important too, but the hate isn't, I believe, stemming from them. So in 2018, Bell County High School student and valedictorian Ben Bowling took the opportunity to share some inspirational quotes during his commencement speech. Located in southern Kentucky, nearly 80% of the county voted for Trump in the 2016 presidential election. To quote valedictorian Ben Bowling, "This is the part of my speech where I share some inspirational quotes I found on Google." Bowling is reported as saying, quote, "Don't just get involved, fight for your seat at the table. Better yet, fight for a seat at the head of the table," from Donald Trump, unquote. The crowd responded by erupting in applause. Before the commotion died down, Bowling interjected, "Just kidding, that was actually Barack Obama," and the crowd quickly went silent. What I would like to call the headline model for understanding attitudes and behaviors would have you believe that facts speak to us like numbers in an equation, where 4 + 4 = 8, is similar to exposure to the same information equals consensus. But as we all know, that is not the scenario described by Bowling, and that is not the scenario many of us experience when we're arguing with an uncle or someone across the table at a Thanksgiving meal or something like that. The audience did not judge the merits of the quote by its principles, but by who allegedly said it. In one study that I like to show my students, authors analyzed climate change survey data of 3 populations: the US public, scientists who were actively publishing on energy technologies, and congressional policy advisors, all very well-versed experts, you would argue, in the field of climate science. And its findings were uncovering, quote, "evidence that the ideological divide about global warming gets significantly larger according to respondents' knowledge about politics, energy, and science," unquote. More knowledge, in other words, has seemed to increase the divide between climate skeptics and those who believe it is real and human-induced. Now, of course, political scientists have a term for this. They've been studying it for decades. It's called motivated reasoning. Motivated reasoning is, oversimplified perhaps, just simply the argument that we accept the data that confirms our values and we reject out of hand any data that disconfirms or seems to contradict our own values. There's actually been a very interesting paper that came out a year ago that notes that the most partisan deniers of climate change actually are the most likely to read peer-reviewed articles on climate science so they can be better positioned to argue against it. So this idea that facts alone will bust myths is itself a fairy tale. Now, there is an interesting phenomenon that I have been looking at related to this issue of social distance, and this is based on the idea if you can get people closer and interacting with each other, reducing their social distance, it can have potentially profound effects on their attitudes and values. And there's some evidence to this. So if you look at society's evolving attitudes toward LGBT communities, more than 2/3 of US adults think gay marriage should be legally recognized. If you were to go back 20 years, that figure was only 27%. Nearly 9 in 10 adults now say they know somebody who regularly interacts with somebody who is gay or lesbian. And of course, we've all heard stories of how religious cultural warriors on the right have come around and changed their attitudes when somebody close to them has, quote unquote, come out. Now, the idea that empathy can actually overpower the teachings of religious dogma, I think speaks volumes in terms of some of the potential political power in this idea of reducing social distance. But then that also asks the question, what about those groups who cannot or do not wish to be in the same room with you? Of course, we live a global world. Getting people together around the room is, if not impossible, sometimes difficult. I can't imagine undocumented worker in the United States self-identifying themselves saying, yes, I'd like to be in the same room with somebody from the right. What do you do then? And of course, it's also worth recognizing that many of the people that voted for, who voted for Trump in 2016 also actually voted for Obama 4 years earlier. And those Obama voters who switched came from overwhelmingly counties who saw an increase of diversification, specifically among Latino and Latina population. There's actually quite a bit of data that notes that there's a positive relationship between state-level anti-Hispanic hate crimes and recent Hispanic immigration in those states. So it's important to us to not just think integration for the sake of integration. Getting people together for the sake of getting people together will solve all of our problems, because sometimes, as evidenced by how certain members of communities react to that, it can result in evoke very hostile sort of values and attitudes toward people that are viewed as different from themselves. And this is where I think food comes into the picture in some interesting ways, right? No matter what God you pray to, or if you're a secular humanist, if you're a never Trumper or if your closet's full of Make America Great Again apparel, no matter your political affiliations, we all have to eat. And most of us, if not, I dare say all of us, have some sort of unique interest in food, right? A lot of us talk about wanting to learn more about our food system. I've never even heard music aficionados say, I want to learn more about our music system or anything like that. Food is unique. Food elicits a sort of awe and wonder and brings us into encounters and situations in ways that I think we can leverage and take advantage of. Because we know there's lots of social psychological research out there that points to, through experiments, that if you bring people together into a space unwillingly for the sole purpose of talking out your differences, then it's immediately an elbows out posture, meaning it's hostile. People immediately begin signing identities to others, friend, enemy, us, them, black, white, Democrat, Republican, and nothing ever gets accomplished in terms of what you wanted to get accomplished. Food is a bit unique, what I found, and I'm sure most of you, if not all of you, have experienced this as well. Food brings people together for the purposes of maybe wanting to learn how to grow something, wanting to cook something, and wanting to learn more about food in some way. And as a result of that, you might find yourself a row away from somebody with different colored skin who prays to a different God. You find yourself talking with him or her. You find yourself opening up in ways you would never open up to them, both in terms of what you say, but also in terms of your own motivated reasoning, in terms of what you let seep through into you. And what I found is that can be potentially quite transformative if we do it and think about it intentionally. So I have a couple kind of origin stories that I want to just mention briefly, that kind of led me. As I mentioned, this all started as kind of noise, and over the course of the years, that noise eventually turned into a signal that I've been kind of zeroing more in on. And the first study I have referred to as the strawberry study. I've actually repeated it over the years too. But I'll just mention the first one. It was a pilot study, purely experimental, where I recruited about a dozen middle-class Coloradoans to involve themselves in picking strawberries for a day and knowing people who have conducted ethnographic research of industrial strawberry pickers. I know there's a particular dress, I know there's a particular style in which you're supposed to pick so they can maximize production, and I tried to have them replicate that over the course of this day. And I was really interested initially in understanding how different types of knowledge might change attitudes and behaviors. And so first I had them watch a documentary and read material on industrial strawberry production. And then I had them actually do it, right? So kind of a headline model, a heartland sort of model way of approaching this. And I also thought maybe I'll also have them take pictures over the course of the day because I like to experiment. And sometimes stuff sticks, sometimes it doesn't. But the pictures were really telling. And I'll start with those. So at the beginning of the day, the pictures were all quite frankly benign. Landscape pictures, selfies, pictures of the plants and the sky. But then over the course of the day, the pictures themselves had changed in tone, in terms of effect, and in terms of the feel for them. So what began to be emphasized over the course of the day by afternoon was the physical, I could feel the physical exertion trying to be expressed in these pictures that became part of the foreground as opposed to the background. So you would see sweaty build caps, people taking pictures of that, or stained fingers, or sweaty knees. There was sweat, there was dirt. Everybody had taken a picture that showed, I felt like tried to express the physicality. I thought that was kind of interesting. And then when I interviewed people about a week later about the experience, that came out in how they talked. So, a bleeding heart liberal is not a term that Nick would ever use to describe himself. Nick was somebody who, when we first met and I first interviewed him, he said some quite derogatory things about immigrant laborers in the United States. Yet by the study's end, his tone had changed. When asked to reflect upon his time in the field picking, quote, "Yeah, that probably isn't a job many Americans would want." He then took a long breath and exhaled, giving himself some time to think, and added, "Maybe we do need immigrants for some things. Maybe I can be a bit too harsh." Now, granted, I realize we ought to temper our praise for this telling change of heart because, of course, immigrants are there more than just to provide cheap labor. But nevertheless, I think it was an interesting pivot. And again, this was just a pilot study that led me to do other studies too. And I've heard similar themes as a result of having others do this experiment as well. Now, the second study very early study that I did was a very long and a very laborious longitudinal study, where I identified people who are new to community-supported agriculture schemes, new to farmers markets, and new to community food co-ops. I identified them and I interviewed them right as they were partaking in those experiences. And then I tracked them and I interviewed them 2 years later if they were still involved in those spaces. And then I also did kind of a control group where I phone interviewed more than 100 individuals along the Colorado Front Range as well, of people who have never participated or were currently participating in those spaces either. And there have quite a few interesting findings that came out of this. This study has also been published, but I really just want to focus on one. Now, overwhelmingly, one of the things I did is I asked individuals to tell me why you were getting your food from those spaces? Why were you participating in those spaces? And an overwhelming answer was they were there because they thought the food tasted better and that it was healthier. And there's actually quite a bit of research that suggests that points to this as well, that individuals, we like to think maybe they bring themselves to those spaces for larger social justice issues, but for many, they're just for these more kind of individualized sort of purposes. It tastes better and it's healthier. But what I found was interesting is while the data supported that, the reason why they stayed 2 years later were for different motivations. So they might have still thought the food was tastier and healthier, but they remained active in those spaces, and their self-described principal motivation for remaining in those spaces had shifted. They now self-identified as being there because they wanted to support local growers, they wanted to support their community. Many mentioned issues related to sustainability. this is really interesting, and I was able to glean from interviewing further that there was something about the physical, the encounters, the experiences they had in these spaces that caused them to pivot, you could argue, from being more kind of inward focused to something that's what I would refer to as a sociologist, more pro-social, something that's more about us versus about me and my family. I thought that was interesting too. And the last foundational study that I conducted about 10 years ago, actually it happened over a long period of time, involved what's referred to as the food stamp challenge in the States, or the SNAP challenge. SNAP is the acronym for the Supplemental Nutritional Assistance Program, which is the term we use for food stamps. This is the idea of people trying to live on food stamps, which is roughly $4.20 a day, trying to eat and survive off food stamps. And of course, some celebrities have taken this, and much to the chagrin of many people, and it's problematic to think that a very affluent person can do this and have a meaningful experience. But I wanted to do this because I signed this to my students about 10 years ago, because I thought it'd be interesting for them to do. And what turned into an interesting experiment actually resulted in something that I wanted to learn more about, because I started to hear similar themes as I had the students do this from semester to semester to semester. So I had them do the challenge for 1 week and write kind of a response piece at the end of the week. And I also had them just answer 4 questions. I'm a social scientist. I like people to answer questions and see if things change over periods of time too. So the 4 questions I had them answer: benefits are generous and sufficient to eat well. The majority of recipients abuse these payments. Recipients have no right to complain about benefits. And I believe recipients have used benefits to buy steak and lobster. There's this meme that, that people are using this to throw lavish parties and stuff like that. And it was had them scored on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 strongly disagree, 10 strongly agree. Now, over the course of a few years, more than 1,000 students ended up participating in this exercise. And so I have an N of over 1,000, and I realize it's just 4 questions. Students are non-representative. I know all that stuff. I'm just interested in interesting stuff. And so I'm showing this to you because it's interesting. And so this kind of illustrates how over the course of more than 1,000 respondents, the average score of those 4 answers changed as a result of when they were answering those questions before they took the challenge and how they answered the questions at the end. Now, I realize that correlation is not causation, and for that reason, I do like to dive deeper when I find things that are interesting and try to learn more. And so what I did for this is I then partook in a more extensive research project involving many more participants in Colorado, and I actually was able to identify individuals who are politically resistant to social entitlement programs, and in some cases who end up being quite resistant and who said some pretty bad things about people on welfare, to put it that way. So what I want to do is I'm going to try something a little unconventional now. I'm going to end by doing a brief reading, because here I am talking about the importance of the Heartland model, and yet the lecture style is by nature me telling you stuff. And I thought maybe by providing a short reading from one of the chapters dealing with SNAP, it might elicit a different kind of layer of understanding what's going on here. And so this reading comes from the chapter on SNAP. It is 12 months after individuals completed the challenge. And so I interviewed people before they did it, after they did the challenge, and then I returned and interviewed them 12 months later because I was interested to know if their attitudinal changes have stuck. If they were actually long-term sort of sentiments or if they were fleeting. So if you'll humor me, I'm going to just spend a few minutes and read from the book to try to get at an aspect of things that I haven't been able to really touch at yet by lecturing to you all. Lisa lit up the room every time she entered. Her face was bright and inviting, as were her eyes. She was quick to anger, quicker to laugh, though neither lasted very long. She lived in Denver and taught economics and business classes at one of the city's many post-secondary institutions. She was a registered independent who leaned either left or right, depending on the issue. Quote, I voted for George W. the first time, then against him, then for McCain before becoming an Obama fan, she proudly explained, brandishing her independent streak. She cast her vote for Gary Johnson, the Libertarian candidate, in the 2016 elections. In her first interview, she described herself as socially and culturally liberal, but fiscally conservative. She was pro-gay marriage and pro-choice, but, quote, against most entitlement programs, unquote, later adding, people ought to be able to do what they want with and to their bodies, unquote. She was quick to anger during the first interview when the subject turned to welfare and entitlement programs more generally. I still vividly recall one instance of her grabbing two fistfuls of her hair and making a primal scream at the mention of government programs in Scandinavian countries. Quote, please don't get me started on what I think of those damn countries, she said in an almost pleading tone. You can guess where some of those attitudes landed after the SNAP challenge. I wouldn't be talking about her now if nothing changed. What I want to discuss here is where those perceptions landed after having been removed from the experience for about a year. Never one to beat around the bush, Lisa was quite comfortable reflecting on her memories of the SNAP challenge. Quote, the smell of tuna or bad coffee, anytime I boil water, the few times I go too long without eating and my stomach starts to rebel, you know, that feeling when your stomach is turning and tossing, unquote. She was responding to a question about if the SNAP challenge ever enters her mind, and if so, how? What I found striking about her answers was how the experiences were being recalled, namely in ways that were physically immediate and intimate, rather than abstract, cognitive, and cold facts. She struggled to elaborate when asked to do so, finding it hard to put the feelings to words. At one point she said, anger building her eyes and across her face, quote, it's hard to explain, you just have to trust me when I say the lessons of the challenge are still with me. Why? I can't say. Her attitudes about welfare and entitlement sounded a lot like what I heard 12 months earlier. The experiment mellowed her on the subjects that had, prior to the exercise, animated her speech and actions. I noticed immediately that those 12 months did little to mitigate those changes, as she remained slow to provoke when talking about SNAP. To probe the matter further, I read from a transcript of that very first interview. The specific text recited came from one of those moments where Lisa's anger had flashed. It included the line cited earlier about how people ought to be able to do what they want while needing to take responsibility for what life throws at them. She started to smile before I could finish, followed immediately by that spontaneous laugh that had the same recognition that flashed in her eyes. Did I really say that? She asked with a look on her face that clearly indicated recognition that she had. Look, we all need to take responsibility for our choice, but an argument could be made that programs like SNAP increase choice by putting options on the table that wouldn't otherwise be available, unquote. The attitudes required to the challenge seem to have held for Lisa. This statement aligns with what I found talking with others, though of course their experiences were all different. One quality that appeared to be shared, however, was this curious inability to talk about why the lessons of the SNAP challenge was still, in the words of one, lingering with them. Lyle, when asked about whether he thinks about those 2 weeks, mentioned how there's something about the challenge lingering with me. I don't even have to be doing something related to food, he said. This was followed moments later by the following revelation had the day prior while driving. Quote, the memory of me reusing tea bags, a cost-cutting strategy he had used when he was doing the experiment, or the challenge, rushed to my mind, totally out of the blue. Maybe because a song was playing on the radio, maybe because I had this meeting with you today. It wasn't the first time something like that happened, having a memory like that about the exercise, unquote. Embodied memory scholars write about how certain experiences register as intense pulses of recognition, knowledge that struggles to be contained within the boxes of representation. Cultural theorist Brian Masumi refers to these events as memory without content. It might be a smell which triggers a flood of emotions and sensations, causing you to feel a long-deceased grandmother's embrace, or a taste which teleports you back to childhood with the anxieties and comforts that accompany this age. We all know the power of such memories, even though we cannot fully communicate what precisely it is that we are remembering. We acquire this intelligence not by reading or by being told things, but by doing something. We acquire it by taking a journey to the heartland. So I'd like to stop there and leave the rest of the time for questions and answers. Those studies that I showed you that were foundational actually then resulted in a number of other studies that I have since conducted, which in some respects kind of replicated what I found in those earlier ones. Just to introduce what some of those look like, I recreated the strawberry study, having people pick strawberries for one day followed by raspberries for a day. This gentleman was a participant that's a Celtic cross, is used among white nationalists. He was a self-avowed white nationalist. I got him to participate in this, and his comments were quite insightful in terms of how he had a change of heart in some ways as a result of the experience. I had urban foodies who were self-admittedly very anti-big ag, which also bled into being anti-conventional farmer, it turned out. And I had them detassel field corn for a day. And it was an interesting experience for them. I also had urban foodie progressives in the United States. The Second Amendment has to deal with guns, of course. And of course, there's probably no more hot button issue in the United States than guns now, as has been for quite a while. And I had them attend wild game dinners, which were held in rural Colorado and rural Texas. They were there for the food. I told them, if you love organic meat, you're going to love these events. It's free range. It's non-caged. But then while they were there, they had conversations with people they would never have had conversations with, and both sides came to some degree of some recognition, which wasn't to say that the anti-Second Amendments suddenly registered with the NRA, but they were open. It resulted in those cognitive filters that motivated reasoning being let down a bit, and to allow some information to come in on both sides, which was encouraging. And then I also talk about my experiences helping to facilitate the urban food plan in Denver, and an attempt of my research team to try to open up those conversations so that stakeholders just do not mean urban entrepreneurs and urban eaters, but stakeholders mean rural communities and the farmers that are going to be growing that food. And we've had some really interesting conversations, facilitated workshops, ways in which we can bring urban folks together and rural folks together in ways to have conversations around food that doesn't just result in everybody in the country thinking everybody in urban areas doesn't care a lick about what goes on out there, and folks in urban areas think that rural areas are stereotypes in some ways that are derogatory and unhelpful to these conversations. And it's been a really insightful study that I've been learning a lot from too, and have been encouraged by the experiences that have been had by both sides. So with that, I just want to say thank you yet again, and I'm really looking forward to having some questions. I hope there's some time. I know I talked a while. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much, Michael. There is time. I think we have about 15 minutes for questions. We started 5 minutes late.